Now, this demo on which we worked here is generally working. The character account here is updating. But if you compare this to the demo I showed you earlier in this course, where I showed you what we would be building, then you see that one important feature is missing here. As I type more and more characters, if we go below 10 remaining characters, in the demo I showed you, the color here did change and the background color of the input field changed. And that's not happening here. Now we need 2 additional building blocks to make this work. The first building block is that we need to learn how we can manipulate our DOM elements such that they do change color, so how we can change the styling of DOM elements with JavaScript. And then in a second step, we will need to find out how to do that conditionally. And let's start with the first step. Let's learn how we can change the color of DOM elements. And for this, I'll actually stay on this page here and open my developer tools, because we learned that here in these tools, we can also execute some JavaScript code. Here we can also run simple snippets, and I can, for example, use the document object to also select an element here. And we can even store that selected element in a constant or variable then, and I'll do that so that we can play around with it here. And let's say I want to start with this span here. Now for that, keep in mind, if I select it, that this has an ID of remaining chars. So in this console here, I'll get my span element by writing document get element by ID, and then the ID I'm looking for here is remaining chars, like this. If I now hit enter, this span element is this span which I selected here. We can, by the way, log something here in this console by just typing the variable name. This will not work in your other JavaScript code. There, if you just type a variable name, this will not log it to the console. But here in this console of the developer tools, that is what will happen. So here we can log something like that. So if I got my span element here, and I did recreate this constant here because this page reloaded, because I changed my JavaScript code, then we can use this span element to do things with it. And for example, we did learn that we can set the text content to some new text, like 59, for example, like this. Now, this updated here on the page. But we can also not just change the text content, but as we saw it before at the example of the anchor element, we can also change other properties of our DOM elements. For example, on the anchor, we changed the href property to change the target destination. And on basically all HTML elements, we can access a style property, which allows us to change the styling of that element, or to set styles as we would set them with the style attribute in HTML. So here I can access style, and then what's stored in this style property of a DOM element is actually a nested object with more properties. Hence we can add another dot here to dive into those nested properties. And what we find here are now basically equivalents to the different CSS properties we learned about. For example, there is a text align property. And of course, there is a text align CSS property. The main difference, which is important to note though, is that they are written differently. In CSS, we would have text-align, all lowercase. In JavaScript, the equivalent is the same word or a combination of words, but without a dash, instead using this camel case notation, which we learned is the main convention for naming things in JavaScript. And this convention is used here because dashes are not allowed in variable or property names. So text dash align would be invalid JavaScript code, and that's why it's named text align written like this. But the interesting thing is that we can set this to the same values we can assign to the CSS property text align. So here we could use center or left as a string though. In CSS it would just be center or left as keywords, but that's because CSS is a different programming language. In JavaScript, if you would just write left or center like that, JavaScript would look for variables or built-in commands, functions with such names. That's why we need to turn this into a string instead. Now, text align actually is a property which wouldn't have a real effect on this span, and therefore let's use a different property, and let's maybe use color, which we can use to set the color. We can set color to any value that would be expected in CSS, again with the limitation that it should be a string. So here, for example, we could set it to red or to a hex code or to RGB, and then maybe 0, 120, 50. And if I now hit enter, this changed to a greenish color. And if I inspect this span again, indeed we see that this style attribute was added now, and that it has this style set. And that's what we can do with JavaScript as well. We can also change the style attribute and then the different CSS properties that can be changed, like color, like text align, like background color, and so on. And as so often, feel free to play around with that. Just keep in mind that it's this camel case notation and that your values should be strings. So for example, if we want to change the font size, we could simply write 30 pixels like this as a string, and then this would get bigger. Now that's one way of changing the styling. And of course, since I'm just doing this here in this console in the DevTools, whenever I reload the page, all these changes are gone. If we would write it in this JavaScript code here, of course, they would persist, since it would be updated on the running page by the code that is part of this page. But now we covered this. There is another way of changing the styling or the look of our elements.